turbo engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
Questions. Research.
technology. Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists. Hello, welcome to this week's Naked Scientists, the show where we bring you the latest breakthroughs in science, technology and medicine with me, Chris Smith. And this week we're asking, what is a language?
From Cambridge University's Institute of Continuing Education, this is The Naked Scientists.
It's probably a question you don't think about very often, but it governs pretty much everything we do, including how we communicate, learn, comprehend, and even express our identities. So this week, we're going to explore the science of language, which is called linguistics, and a bit later on, I'm even going to have a crack at learning a bit of Greek. But first, to explore the purpose of language, here's David Crystal, who's an honorary professor of linguistics at the University of Bangor.
Well, language is a system of communication, obviously, everybody knows that. But the point is, it exists in three big forms: in spoken form, speech, in written form, and also, don't forget, in signed form for people who are deaf and in other circumstances too. And there are other types of language around the world, but these are the three main kinds. And the thing about language is it has two sides. There's not just the three main types I've just mentioned, but it's also, you ask the question, what is it for? That's part of the definition of language. And the answer is, it's there to enable us to understand each other, intelligibility. That's the big function of language. Less noticed is that it's there to express our identity, who we are, where we're from, what community we belong to, and so on. And least of all mentioned in some of the definitions of language, it's there for us to play with, to be creative with. This is the side of literature and all the playful jokes and everyday riddles and things like that. Little children playing with language just because it's fun to do. So there are these two big sides to language, the form and the function. Important to remember both.
I suppose there's also a scientific side to this, isn't there? Because although we use it, we're all familiar with communicating via language, there's also the opportunity to study how we ended up where we are today.
Yes, the science of language now, linguistics, that's the definition of linguistics, the science of language. Now, what does that mean? It means, like any science, you study language as objectively as you can, comprehensively, systematically. All sciences do that. You describe the languages of the world, and there are an awful lot of them, over 6,000 languages in the world, and they've all got to be described, spoken, written, and signed. Big task. And then once you've carried out some of these descriptions, you try and work out what all these languages have in common. A theory of language, of human language. What is it that makes language possible in the human being? And you do this in a scientific kind of way by setting up models of language and asking questions and testing them in experiments and things like that. And if you think that science is all about machines and things, well, there is that side of linguistics as well, called phonetics. Phonetics, the science of speech, sound making and sound reception. And if you go into a phonetics lab, you'd think you were in a scientific lab because there are machines all over the place analyzing the acoustics of speech and things like that. So it's definitely a science, although we mustn't forget that it also has its artistic side as well.
When do we think it first manifest? How far back in time do we have to go to, do we think, start to recognise, if we were an observer, two individuals speaking to each other?
The estimates vary enormously, somewhere between 50,000 years ago and 100,000 years ago, and so on. It all depends what you mean by language, you see. You say spoken language, well, that would require a vocal tract and all the organs of speech, like our tongue and everything like that, to be fully formed. And that's a matter for evolutionary biologists to work out. When was that possible? But maybe it wasn't speech to begin with. Maybe people were communicating very happily using signs and gestures and facial expressions and things like that. And the other point to remember is that we may not know what the origins of language are, though there have been many theories about it, but we can also study the history of language scientifically, by which I mean you can go back through all the written records that have been made of the different languages of the world. And that will take us back to something like 5 or 6 or 7,000 BC, early sign systems, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and all of that kind of thing. So you can start studying the way language changes, how language evolves, if you like, over quite a considerable period of time.
And do we think that languages tend to evolve in parallel the same way because of the way our brains work, because of the way our anatomy works? So we tend to converge on the same linguistic solutions to communicate things. And so if you look at different disparate cultures around the world, you see the same evolution of language in those groups.
Well, the main evidence for that is the way in which children acquire language. And children from a wide range of languages have been studied now over the last 50 years or so. And indeed, it does seem to be the case that the evolution of language in the child is pretty well the same as you go from place to place to place. So, all children start using their first words around about 12 months of age, and then they start putting two words together round about 18 months of age, and so on and so forth. Round about age 3, they start stringing sentences together. And at the same time, they're developing their pronunciation along certain lines. They're developing vocabulary along certain lines. And the parallels as you go from culture to culture are really quite striking. Which doesn't mean to say, of course, that there aren't differences, and indeed there are, as we all know. The French have a word for it, the Welsh have a word for it. Every language has got certain concepts, certain words that don't easily translate into other languages. And this suggests that there is also an evolutionary trend towards individuality, towards identity. My language is not your language, and I show that by allowing it to develop in society and also therefore in my brain in a distinctive way. And so, yes, there are universals of language, both in acquisition and when you actually compare all the languages of the world in terms of the way they're structured. But we mustn't forget that there's an awful lot of idiosyncrasy and individual differences between these various languages.
Based on everything you've told me so far, does this mean that language is something only humans can have? Or do we think that animals effectively have language as well?
If we include by language body language, that is facial expression and gesture, then it's perfectly plain that an awful lot of animals are able to communicate in a basic sort of way using their facial expressions and their gestures. And indeed, there have been experiments over the years to try and train certain types of animal to use human language. Some of the ape world, for example, the chimpanzees, where they've been taught signing and learnt a pretty significant vocabulary of communication and were able to play with that vocabulary a little bit to enable a kind of conversation to take place. But it's all very limited, and nothing at all at the moment, as far as we know, resembles the ability of the human being to use language in an infinite kind of way. That is, to use sentences that nobody's ever heard before, and yet you understand them. To use vocabulary, to play with vocabulary. You're putting in new words, new constructions that nobody's ever used before, and yet we understand them. That kind of creativity does seem to be innately present in human beings, and no animal, so as far as we know, has reached anything like that level of achievement.
Thank you to David Crystal for that crystal clear insight into the basis of language and linguistics. So what do we know about what's actually happening, though, in our brains when someone is learning a language, for example? Well, I went to meet Mirjana Bojic from the University of Cambridge's Department of Psychology. Mirjana is a cognitive neuroscientist who studies language.
In order for us to start understanding what's happening in the brain, we need to narrow it down to what type of information within the language signal we would want to look into. And this is something that linguists have defined for us, that, for instance, when we are speaking now, so we are processing sound of different words or individual elements within these words, phonology. We are processing the meaning of individual words and the sentences. This is now known as semantics. We are processing how different words are put together in sequences to know that something is a grammatical sequence in language or not. So this is known as syntax or grammar. And it's basically been shown that all of these different types of information, their processing can be differentiated in the brain.
When one thinks about the process of us communicating, it starts with me making a sound that goes to your ears. So at what stage do your ears extract from the sounds that are coming in? Because there's sounds in this room, there's us wriggling on the settee, and it extracts just the speech from that. How is that done?
This is done hierarchically, really. So what has been shown is that the brain is going to be extracting first the very low-level information from the signal. So these would be frequencies, for instance. It's been shown that this is in early auditory processing areas of the brain. So these are known as primary auditory cortices. And these are parts of the brain that are in temporal lobe. So that's part of the brain that's close to your temples and close to your ears on both sides of the brain. And then it goes progressively from there to extract more linguistic information, more language-specific information in areas that are a little bit further apart from the primary auditory cortices. So there is this hierarchical processing of different levels of information, from low-level perceptual information to meaning of individual words.
So it pulls out what is speech first. Say there's 5 other people in this room and they're all having a conversation. How do I focus just on information from you if you're the person I'm talking to?
Mm-hmm. Well, language obviously is working together, so to speak, with other cognitive processes in order to make it flow, and we can use languages as efficiently and effortlessly as we do. So in order to do that, we would be using something called selective attention. So this is the ability to focus on the properties of the signal that are relevant and to ignore the signal that's irrelevant. And that is going to be more or less difficult depending on what you're focusing on and what's the interference. So it's easy enough to differentiate between speech that you want to focus on and music, for instance, because they differ on all sorts of low-level features would be different between them. Whereas if somebody is speaking in different language, for instance, that's going to be slightly more difficult. If somebody is speaking in the same language that we are having conversation in, that's going to be more difficult. So there are these sort of hierarchically different levels of processing that are more or less difficult to suppress depending on their features, their properties.
When I'm listening to you talking to me, I think my brain is anticipating what you're probably going to say next. And when that is the case, it's happy. When that's not the case, it's sort of piquing my attention. Is that how I'm staying trained on and paying attention to what you're saying? Is that how I'm decoding it on the fly?
We are certainly predicting quite a lot of what's likely to happen next. So that's based on your general knowledge of language, the knowledge of the conversation that's happening. There is always this interaction between the top-down processing and the bottom-up processing, meaning that there is going to be information that's extracted from the signal itself, so low-level properties of the signal, and then the top-down knowledge of what's likely to happen given the language that we are speaking in. And there is going to be integration between those two ultimately that's going to give us this effortless way that we use language easily as we do.
And what about if I come along and learn another language? How does my brain cope with that? Because I can speak French. So how does my brain know I'm in English mode and I understand that and I think in that and I put the words together in the right order? But when I want to, I can flick a switch mentally and then I'm in French mode.
That is a question that has been a focus of a lot of attention scientifically in the last, I would say, 2-3 decades. What has been shown, I think pretty consistently, is that having 2 languages in this bilingual context leads to competition between them. So they are co-activated constantly, regardless of whether one of those languages is irrelevant for the particular communicative context. So for instance, we are using English now and our other languages are not really relevant for this particular context, but they are going to be at some level competing with the signal that we actually intend to use. And that's likely then to lead to some process of sort of competition and selection and competition between the two. So this has been one of the very interesting things in bilingualism literature that show that there is this consistent suppression of the irrelevant signal that's taking place in order to use the relevant signal.
Mirjana Bojic from the University of Cambridge there. You're listening to The Naked Scientists with me, Chris Smith, and still to come, it's all Greek to me. And it really is. I'm going back to school in a bid to learn a bit of a new language. But first, we're going to talk about Russian dolls now. And this is a term that linguists use to describe when one phrase fits inside another, which is a characteristic feature of how we humans speak. For example, I might say, when I left home this morning, because it was sunny, I didn't take my umbrella. We thought that that trait was uniquely human, but now comprehensive analysis of vocalizations recorded from orangutans has revealed to Warwick University's Adriano Lamira a similar pattern of speaking among them. So, is this pointing towards the evolutionary origins of how we learn to speak?
I study great apes, both in the wild and in captivity, to really try to understand and decipher their vocal communication. Because a lot of times we know that our species is unique in terms of our language capacity, and oftentimes we quickly assume that we are categorically different from our closest living ancestors, the great apes, when in fact we draw these conclusions without actually putting in the necessary effort to prove that those capacities are indeed absent in our closest living relatives. And so I kind of use and study great ape communication, cognition cultures as a time machine to go back to our own ancestors and try to understand what they were capable of and why did that steer our lineage towards what was to become one day fully fledged language.
Because people often say that some dramatic jump or mutation or shift happened that endowed humans with a range of things, including language. Whereas if what you're saying is true, then it's a more gentle slide in evolutionary terms where various building blocks are assembled and then slowly come together in us to give us those abilities. So they should therefore be vestiges of those building blocks out there in the natural world. We just need to find them.
Correct, exactly. So actually the principles of evolution by natural selection tells us that we should expect those gradations. We should expect a continuum within phylogenetic families.
How did you put this to the test?
So actually the behavior came to us. We were following wild orangutans daily and recording every vocal behavior that they did because we want to catalog their repertoire before they go extinct. And when we started to try to really quantify the characteristics of these loud calls produced by males, we started to see hints of different layers of signals.
When you say layers, tell us a bit more about what you mean by that and why that's special.
Right. So as layers, I mean different levels of organization. So this characteristic of putting a signal or a pattern within itself or within a similar signal or pattern. An example would be Russian dolls, where you have one doll that fits within itself. This is important because this is how we tend to organize our own stream of words and sentences. I can be saying a phrase and then insert another phrase in there to further explain my point. And then I step out again of that little clause and I continue my original sentence. So this is something that languages do all the time. It's claimed to be universal and therefore claimed to be one of those things that really makes human language distinct from every other animal vocal system, is that only we can insert a sequence of sounds within another sequence of sounds. And so when we started to see hints of layers in wild orangutan loud calls, we thought maybe this is the type of evidence that has been missing.
You've sent me some examples of what you recorded. Can you talk us through what we're going to hear here and signpost us towards each of the examples? So which one would you like to start with, and just tell us what we're going to hear before we play it?
So I brought two recordings along. The first one are the pulsa, which are kind of the climax of the wild orangutan loud call. These are the kind of extended notes to be heard and broadcasted across large distances of the forest. So these we can think of as the larger Russian doll. Exactly. So these are the extended notes that carry over the forest so that other orangutans, both females and males, hear the calling male.
And those punctuated loud noises, those are the big outer Russian doll. So those are the sounds that you're saying. If I was speaking to you and I wanted to include a phrase inside something I'm already saying, those would be the outer capsule, as it were. And now we're going to think about what's going in the middle.
Correct. We're going to hear grumbles, which we can think of as the smaller layer of our sound Russian doll. So we can still hear the pace of the larger notes, right? We can hear so we still have the tempo of the larger pulses, which is kind of the carrier phrase, so to speak, the larger doll. And now we have smaller notes, staccato notes, with their own little tempo inside the main beat. Regular notes inside regular notes, which kind of effectively is an example of a pattern nested within itself.
You're arguing that because they can do this, that is the foundation for what we do when we're actually nesting phrases and doing recursive speech patterns.
Exactly. So one of our most important tasks here was to try to disentangle, are these not just the result of a bodily resonance, for example? And so what we found is when characterizing the two tempos and seeing their relationship, their ratio, the quicker, smaller tempo was not related to the larger one. And so what this led us to conclude and be able to exclude the possibility that the smaller tempo is indeed not an artifact of the larger one, or vice versa.
Given that orangs are more distantly related to us than, say, chimps and bonobos are, if they've got this, and this is part of the origin of us being endowed with a similar ability, does this mean it should be in other great apes? And is it therefore a question of going looking for this now in bonobo and chimpanzee vocalizations, for example, which would give confidence to what you're saying is right?
Absolutely. That's an excellent question. And yes, that would be the assumption. If orangutans being the earliest diverging lineage of great apes, one would assume that closer related lineages to us, such as chimps and bonobos and gorillas, they would also have. However, I think right now the understanding is that all the great apes really need to be treated as a family, because different lineages have gone to do different adaptations. So, for example, we know that our last common ancestor with great apes was not as terrestrial as chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas. And so, in terms of lifestyle, actually, orangutans, although genetically relatively further, they still live a lifestyle and an environment that is actually closer to what our ancestor lived with. And so I think in this sense, we should definitely go and search in the African apes. The clues may be there and they may have been hidden in plain sight, just like they have in the case for the orangutan long calls.
Absolutely fascinating. Warwick University's Adriano Lamira there. Well, finally on today's programme, I'm going to put what I've learned so far to the test and have a crack at learning a bit of a different language, in this case, Greek. Now, I was supposed to meet my teacher, Regina Caruso Fokas, at the University of Cambridge in person, but there was a good reason we couldn't get together.
Because I don't want you to have what I have, which is a long forgotten friend, but ever-present COVID.
And that's a Latin name, isn't it? Of course, coronavirus, corona crown, virus poison in Latin. That's come to visit you today, so we're trying to do this lesson on Zoom. Do you normally teach over Zoom?
Well, it was a very steep learning curve during the years of COVID, because from one day to the next we had to transfer all our teaching online, and initially I thought that would be impossible, but actually it is not impossible. So yes, I still teach from time to time on Zoom, online, and of course many meetings are carried out online, so it's something that is part of our lives now.
This is going to be a really good test for me because I have never tried to learn modern Greek. My encounter with the Greek alphabet was at school trying to do ancient Greek, and I really struggled. I have to admit that I saw all the letters, but I kept trying to turn the Greek sounds into English letters. If you see what I mean, the alpha's obvious because A for alpha, B for beta, but some of the letters, like hora, you'd say that, but it looks like a letter X. And I'd kept wanting to say X instead of hora. Is that something that some people just naturally can get? Because I can't do it.
Well, I'm sure you can if you give it a little bit of a try and concentrate on the sound to letter correspondence for a little more rather than 5 minutes. The alphabet is different than the Latin alphabet, but then again, it's not completely different. There are letters, as you say, that are the same, and this is again, not by coincidence, because the Greek alphabet gave rise to many alphabets in Europe, so Latin is one of them. So there are 24 letters in the Greek alphabet. Some of them are completely different, but others are similar, and they are pronounced similar, like A or like O, as you mentioned, or like the letter Ni, that is the sound corresponding to N in English. So these are close friends, but there are also what we call false friends, letters that look alike in the Greek alphabet and the English alphabet, but then pronunciation is completely different.
I'm in your hands, Regina, so get me actually saying something that sounds half decent and then point out the pitfalls as to how I should try and attack speaking and getting to grips with a language I've never tried to get to grips with.
Learning to read Greek is actually not difficult because the alphabet is what we call transparent. So a letter corresponds to a sound, and that sound is stable wherever that letter is found in the word. So it's not like English or French where there are letters or strings of letters that you actually don't end up pronouncing when you read the word.
You mean like row and row, where they're spelt exactly the same way, but they completely confuse the hell out of foreigners because unless you know the context and know the language, you say them wrong.
Exactly.
Like Leicester. Leicester Square in London completely kills many tourists, doesn't it?
Exactly. Or Peterborough or things like that. So in Greek, what you see is what you get. Greek words tend to be long, especially if you compare them with other European languages words. And again, that has its explanation why they are longer, but it's not uncommon to have words that could be, 8 syllables long as well. So knowing where to stress the word is very helpful, particularly for the purposes of someone learning the language. So there is the word Camillopardali, that I always write on the board for my students when we start reading and writing. And, you have to persevere reading every single syllable. You cannot get away with rushing your way through the word. Every syllable, every letter has to be sounded out. And you do know as well where to put your stress and be absolutely correct.
Does that affect the ability of a listener, to pick up on the meaning? Because if you're forced to speak and enunciate properly to get those stresses right, does that stop people doing what I have a tendency to do, especially if I've had too much coffee, go really fast, swallow bits of words and make it hard for people who don't naturally and natively speak English sometimes to understand?
It does happen, and learners of Greek do complain that we speak very fast. It's natural, we all do that in our native language. So from the listener's point of view, encoding natural speech could be a problem. On the other hand, if you do know that you cannot miss anything out, then your brain starts working in other ways as well. This is one of the best things about learning another language. You train your brain to be more agile and actually be flexible and accept differences that can be extended to other parts of your life as well.
You need to teach me some Greek. So I was thinking, why don't we start with The Naked Scientists? Because I can tell you in French, it's Les Scientifiques en nous, which doesn't have quite the same ring to it. But what would it be in Greek?
So in the singular, that would be gymnos epistemonas.
Gymnos epistemonos.
Epistemonas.
Epistemonas. Is there any masculine and feminine in Greek?
I was going to go there.
Okay.
So if a female scientist is who we are talking about, then that would be gymni epistemonas. So there will be a difference at the ending of the adjective. In that particular noun, however, of scientist, epistemonas, the gender is neutral. So it's for epistemonas for both male and female people. But it's either gymnos epistemonas if we are talking about a male scientist or someone who identifies as male, or gymni epistemonas for someone who is female or identifies as female.
The and the a, is that intrinsic to the noun? Like, because we would say the naked scientist and have a
Well,
word
that
for
would
the,
be-
but is that intrinsic in Greek? I don't need a word for the.
You do.
I do need. So
you
what would be the? What would I say? How would I say the naked scientist then?
And actually, you would say o gymnos epistemonas, I gymni epistemonas. So there is a difference in the gender for the articles. There are 3 genders in Greek: masculine, feminine, and neuter. And the article, as you mentioned, that was a grave omission from my part when you first asked me the question. The article has to be present there. Even when you are saying your name, you don't say ime Chris, you say ime o Chris.
Why is that the convention?
The definite article is part and parcel of the word that cannot be omitted.
Well, I'm pleased to say it's no longer all Greek to me. Thank you very much,
Very
Regina.
good. I expect you in my classes next year then.
Do you think I've got potential?
Oh, yes.
You're too kind. Regina Carusu-Foka, thank you very much. She's from the University of Cambridge. Well, that is all we have time for today, but if this show has resonated with you, then do please get in touch. Perhaps you speak a few different languages and you're keen to pick up a new one or share your knowledge with us. Do drop us a line. It's chris@thenakedscientist.com. You can also, of course, join in on our web forum, thenakedscientist.com/forum. Lastly, if you do enjoy the programmes that we put together for you here every week and you would like to help us to keep this show on the road, do please consider making us a donation. You can do that simply and safely and securely at nakedscientist.com/donate. And to those of you who do already help us out, especially those of you who help us on a regular basis, we are extremely grateful. Thank you. The Naked Scientist comes to you from the University of Cambridge's Institute of Continuing Education. It's supported by Rolls-Royce. I'm Chris Smith, and from all of us here at the team, until next time, thank you for listening and goodbye.